Video about George Washington. Alright, first we're going to talk about George Washington's early life. Now, not much is known about George Washington's early life, but he was born on a farm in Virginia, and his father died at a young age, so he began to idolize his half-brother Lawrence Washington. In school, he excelled at math and geography and thought about going into land surveying or the Navy, both respectable careers at the time. George Washington's mother forbid him from going into the Navy. And later, his half-brother Lawrence died of smallpox after a trip to the Caribbean that was supposed to heal his smallpox. Right now, we're going to talk about the beginning of the French and Indian War. So, at first, he was given a lieutenant colonel's commission and sailed to Fort LeBoeuf to tell the French to leave the Ohio River Valley, and actually almost drowned on the way there. After, in April 1754, when he was made an official officer, lieutenant colonel in the Virginia Regiment, he went to tell the French to leave once more. But this time it ended in the Jumonville Massacre, where George Washington sprang a surprise attack on French officer Jumonville. Because of this, he had to fall back and construct Fort Necessity, that he lost after 8 hours of fighting. During the French and Indian War, his rise to prominence began when he fought with General Braddock and saved parts of his army after they were ambushed at the Battle of Monongahela. Here you could see George Washington leading the troops and General Edward Braddock after he was shot. After this, he was made a colonel in the Virginia militia and oversaw the defense of the western border of Virginia. Here, he instilled strict discipline and even hanged quite a few people for various reasons. This experience and discipline was valuable to him when he became commander-in-chief of the colonial army, because he was able to instill discipline during the siege of Boston and with the help of other professional officers at Valley Forge. And when General Forbes came and started his expedition, which took Fort Duquesne, renamed Fort Pitt, and turned the tide of the French and Indian War, George Washington was with him, and there was a famous incident where they were going to surprise attack the fort, but the two ran into each other. The two sections that were going to attack the fort ran into each other and started firing at each other, and George Washington had to ride down the center to stop them from firing at each other. Alright, let's talk about the interlude. So he entered the Virginia House of Burgesses, which is basically like the Virginia legislature. After that, he married the wealthy widow, Martha Dandridge Custis, and raised his stepchildren with her. He didn't have any real children. He didn't have any official children that were his. And after this, during this, he managed a growing tobacco plantation at Mount Vernon. Right. The Siege of Boston. So after taking command of the Continental Army, he needed to instill harsh discipline in the army, because when he got there, soldiers were coming and leaving as they chose. They were very disorganized. So he went and he instilled discipline and was able to put Boston in a siege. Now, obviously, during the Siege of Boston, you had the famous Battle of Bunker Hill, where the soldiers of the Continental Army fought bravely to keep these two hills, I believe, over here on Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. Joseph Warren died there, as you know, and most of the fighting actually happened on Breedsville. And the reason the Americans were able to hold the British off for so long was because instead of going into the traditional column formation to attack, which limited the how much fire would be on them, because there weren't as many people in a line. They decided to go at them in lines, And because of this, they weren't able to pack a heavy punch at specific points and were basically sitting ducks as they marched up the hill. Now later they did form into column to attack, and that's when they finally took the hills after their third wave of assaults. After this, he had General Knox go up to Ticonderoga and drag down artillery pieces from Fort Ticonderoga in the winter, and he set them up on these hills on the Venice Heights over here. And because of this, the ships that were here were exposed, so the supply line of Boston was cut off. So because of this, British General Thomas Gage evacuated the city. After this, General Howe took over command of the army, the British Army, and set out for New York to land an attack on there, which George Washington predicted and began to prepare the defenses. New York campaign. So Nathaniel Greene was really the one who was in charge of setting up the defenses of Long Island. But when the British arrived, he was actually sick and wasn't at the battle. And the reason the British were able to overcome the defenses so easily, because the Americans didn't guard this pass over here because they didn't know it existed. And so a British loyalist showed them the way, and they were able to outflank, as you see here, the entire Continental Army, causing them to have to retreat back over here. And this was really a miracle that he was able to do the night retreat from August 28th to 29th. So Admiral Howe, yes, General Howe's brother, did not guard this port over here, this passway. He did not guard it. And because of the heavy fog, the British couldn't see what the Americans were doing, which was retreating. So he was able to save George Washington, his entire army, from defeat by retreating over here to Manhattan. That's where he retreated. Okay. We'll fight through New Jersey. So after the decisive defeat at the Battle of Long Island, he was pushed through New York, where he fought at Harlem Heights, White Plains, and Fort Washington. In Fort Washington, he actually had to surrender 2,800 of his soldiers, which was a loss he could not afford. By the time he had been pushed back across the Delaware River, he had been whittled down to just 3,000 soldiers. And because his army was so small, he used the Fabian strategy, which was developed by the Roman consul Fabius Maximus, or the dictator who was put in as dictator for 6 months, as was traditional in Rome when they were faced with crisis. And basically, he was successful against Hannibal by avoiding combat with him and attacking his supply lines, his communications, and would beat him without engaging him. So Washington used this same idea to hit around the British army instead of attacking them directly, which would have totally destroyed his army. Alright, now the Battle of Trenton and Princeton. Everybody knows the story of Trenton. On Christmas Day, George Washington crossed the Delaware River and surprised the garrison at Trenton, leading to their surrender. Now, most people are taught that the Hessians were drunk during the battle. That's why they were not aware that George Washington was coming, and that is not true. The reason they did not know is because of the heavy snow. They were extremely fatigued because they got little sleep, and they were actually sleeping with their guns in uniform. So no, they were not unprepared or drunk. They were very prepared. It's just they were surprised because of the heavy snow. So after this victory at Trenton, he was fighting at Assunpink Creek. It's over here, and it was a bit of a stalemate. And George Washington couldn't keep up with it. He was going to be destroyed. So he decided to move away and move the army across the Delaware River and attack the line of communications for the British Army at Princeton, where they won a victory. So after these two devastating defeats for the British, they developed a new strategy. This new strategy was that General Burgoyne would move south and attempt to attack General Gates's army through New York, while General Howe would push up to New York. There, that way they would cut the colonies in half. But General Howe decided not to take part in this plan and decided instead to attack Philadelphia, where they fought at the Battle of Brandywine Creek, George Washington and General Howe. At Brandywine Creek, George Washington was outflanked, so he dispatched General Greene to act as a rear guard so he could pull back his army so it would not be destroyed. And then he fought again at Germantown, where he led a poorly coordinated assault leading to a defeat. After this, he needed to make winter quarters and made it at Valley Forge, where there was superior terrain, so the British would not be able to attack him. And there, the army was professionally trained by Baron von Steuben. Over here, this picture, you can see George Washington and Raphael. All right, now I'm only focusing on George Washington, so we're not going to be talking about the Saratoga campaign or really much of the Southern campaign. We're just going to be focusing on George Washington. That's why this next slide is the end of the war. But after he got out of Valley Forge, he won a victory at Monmouth that raised the morale of the army. And he waited for around New York for nearly 2 years while the fighting shifted to the Southern Theater, where General Greene was dispatched. Now, he did eventually move south and trapped Cornwallis at Yorktown. You can see here the surrender. And this is George Washington. I believe this is Benjamin Lincoln, who actually had to surrender to the British before, so George Washington had him accept the surrender. And actually, General Howe wasn't here. Not General Howe. General Cornwallis was the commander. He was not here because he sent his second out and claimed he was sick. So after this, 2 years later, in 1783, it led to the Treaty of Paris. Now, I already talked about the Constitutional Convention in our last video, so I'm going to kind of skip over that. Long story short, he was president of the convention, where the new Constitution was created and eventually ratified in 1789. And George Washington was made the first president under this document and was the president who was there when the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. So George Washington would form the very first cabinet, and he had General Henry Knox as his Secretary of War. You'll remember him. He acted kind of as George Washington's second in command and artillery commander throughout the war. He actually owned a bookstore before the war, and he's most famous for taking the cannons down from Fort Ticonderoga all the way to Boston at the Siege of Boston, we talked about not long ago. We had Alexander Hamilton, who was one of George Washington's aides-de-camps during the Revolutionary War and led an assault against a redoubt at the Battle of Yorktown. He was made Secretary of the Treasury. We'll talk more about his financial plan and what he did as Secretary of the Treasury momentarily. This is Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, wrote the Declaration of Independence. And his foreign policy, he wanted to break the ties with Britain and pursue a closer friendship with France, who he believed more represented the American values and was closer to America and was America's natural ally instead of Britain. This is Edmund Randolph. He was made Attorney General or Secretary of the Justice Department. All right, now George Washington had an important job. He was the president who assigned the most Supreme Court people on the Supreme Court because he assigned what was then 6 Supreme Court justices. So during his term, it decided there would be 5 judges on the Supreme Court and 1 Chief Justice because this wasn't decided upon until his term, how many judges there would be. And when Washington's picks were all approved unanimously by Congress. And John Jay over here would serve as the first Chief Justice. We'll talk about him pretty soon with the Jay Treaty. All right, now we're going to talk about Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. So the first step of his financial plan was that the debts of each state would be absorbed by the federal government. Now, the states had accumulated massive debts during the Revolutionary War, and Hamilton knew that these needed to be paid off by the federal government because the states would not pay them off. And many believed that this gave too much power to the government, so many people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison attacked this plan. Now, to pay off this massive debt that the federal government would accumulate, he would sell security bonds. After this, a national bank would be created to regulate a national paper currency so inflation wouldn't shoot high and there wouldn't be money. Each state wouldn't have its own money. So they would actually be able to print paper money instead of having just to rely on gold and silver. And then what he would do is he would put tariffs and use subsidies to invest in manufacturing because he believed that the future of America relied on manufacturing, while others like Thomas Jefferson believed that the agrarian economy of the South was what would drive America forward. And eventually Hamilton was right, where the North would have a massive industrial economy during the Civil War, and the South's agrarian economy would lose out. So that was his financial plan, and it was eventually approved, even though there was stiff resistance in Congress. Right, now we're going to talk about Washington's foreign policy. So, in the French Revolutionary War, George Washington declared neutrality. You would think, all right, it's pretty standard, didn't want to get involved in the war, but this was actually cause for extreme controversy because it was debated whether a president could declare neutrality, because in the Constitution it did say, yes, a president would appoint foreign ministers, would negotiate treaties, but they would have to be approved by Congress. So many argued Washington couldn't declare neutrality officially because it was never declared by Congress. And Alexander Hamilton went quick to defend Washington's decision, while James Madison, writing another series of essays against Hamilton, was strongly against Washington declaring neutrality. But George Washington didn't want to cause massive controversy over this, so eventually he sent it to the Senate and the House of Representatives to approve neutrality, and the act was signed declaring America as officially neutral. Over here is a painting of the French Revolution. Now we're going to talk about the Northwest Indian War. So the United States gained control of these territories after the Revolutionary War, but the Native Americans still held these territories as their own. So General Anthony Wayne was sent to the Northwest Territories and won a victory at Fallen Timbers. And then, at the Treaty of Greenville, the Native Americans relinquished control of these territories. See Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, Indiana were the states that would be made up from these territories. All right, the Whiskey Rebellion, one of the most dramatic chapters in Washington's presidency. So, also to fund his economic plan, Alexander Hamilton raised a tax on whiskey. Now, Pennsylvania farmers rose up against this tax and were planning to attack a tax collector. And many of the things that they did were reminiscent of how they protested the taxes during the beginnings of the Revolutionary War. So George Washington, knowing he needed to quell this rebellion, sent Henry Lee, the father of Robert E. Lee, the hero in the Revolutionary War, nicknamed Light Horse Henry Lee because he was a cavalry commander, led a demonstration of 12,950 through Pennsylvania. Now we're going to talk about the Jay Treaty. The Jay Treaty established trade between England and the United States. Now, the reason Jay was sent to England was to avoid armed conflict over the impressment of sailors. Now, what this meant was basically the English would attack American merchant ships and would then force the sailors on those ships into the Royal Navy. America was understandably upset about this, so Jay again was sent to England to stop this. Now, the treaty was largely criticized because it led to stronger ties between the United States and England. It was exceptionally attacked by Thomas Jefferson, and it failed to resolve the issue of the impressment of sailors. All right, everybody. Thanks for paying attention. This was the presidency of George Washington. I wasn't able to really explain his entire presidency or his entire life because thousands of videos and presentations could be made about that, and 15 to 20 minutes isn't a ton of time. So I hope I gave you a nice overview of George Washington's life and his presidency. See you next video, which will be John Adams.